When former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher passed away in 2013, she was given a solemn ceremonial funeral attended by many heads of state. At the same time, the Wizard of Oz song Ding Dong the Witch is Dead reached number 2 in the UK official pop charts. Britain since 1979 experienced the effects of vastly opposing ideologies controlling society that shaped and continue to shape the country today. The decades immediately succeeding the Second World War had seen the economy, by and large, perform well enough, and the main political parties had had an unspoken consensus on priorities. But by the 1970s, both had begun to break down. Thatcher had surprised many by becoming Britain's first female Prime Minister in 1979. While she is remembered for her domination of politics in the 1980s, her first few years could have seen her out of office by the next election. Her initial attempts to revitalise the economy led to recession and a rise in unemployment. But her fortunes turned around completely in 1982 when Argentine forces occupied the Falkland Islands, or Las Malvinas, in the South Atlantic. Despite the huge logistical difficulties that would be involved in taking them back, Thatcher opted for the bold, decisive and confrontational response. It was a tactic she would use again and again in her premiership. The gamble paid off. Thatcher's popularity soared, as did a wave of British patriotism. With a firm base of support across the country, Thatcher was in a far stronger position to take on sections of industry and society she felt were problems. It was her firm belief that the private sector was better than the public sector. Thatcher reversed, or privatised, many of the nationalised industries Attlee's government had created 40 years before. If the company had British in its title, it was most likely sold off. The British Airports Authority, British Gas, British Rail, British Airways and British Steel. Thatcher massively reduced the power of the trade unions, particularly the mining ones, sold off council estate housing, deregulated the stock exchange and eliminated the Greater London Council. In much of her dealings she displayed the same boldness, or ruthlessness, she had shown during the Falklands War, but by the end of the decade popular resistance to her government was growing. Nowhere was this more evident than in her attempt to reintroduce the poll tax, a flat rate system of taxation not seen in Britain since the Middle Ages. There were riots in London. In response, the Conservative Party was so concerned about the unpopularity of Thatcher that they had her replaced with the less controversial John Major. Despite Thatcher's efforts, or in part because of them, a key experience of 80s Britain was mass unemployment. For 5 years of the decade, 3 million people were out of work. Traditional industrial areas, the Midlands, the North West, the North East, Scotland and South Wales, suffered from loss of production. The divide between the rich South East and the rest of the country widened. Immigration continued to be an issue with the rise to prominence of far-right groups like the National Front, following on the footsteps of Enoch Powell's inflammatory Rivers of Blood speech. Other fears gripped the nation in the 1980s. The AIDS pandemic was a terrifying new incurable sickness with attached stigma that claimed the lives of many people, including high-profile deaths like Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen. On the international stage, with the special relationship back on track, Thatcher followed President Reagan's lead in stepping up hostilities with the USSR. The end of the 1980s saw a rapidly changing world with the collapse of communism in Russia and the redrawing of the political map in Eastern Europe, and in particular the reunification of East and West Germany. Thatcher had lost power because her party thought she had become unelectable. This in turn was partly due to her losing the support of the media, in particular the conglomerate of news titles owned by the Murdoch Group. Media was playing an ever-increasing role in the fortunes of government. Before the 1960s, newspaper headlines had been decidedly more deferential, but the Profumo affair, a sex scandal involving high-ranking politicians, call girls and Russian spies in the early 1960s, had changed this attitude. Television shows like That Was the Week That Was and magazines like Private Eye mocked politicians. Channel 4 had been launched in 1982, and B-Sky B in 1989 provided the UK's first 24-hour TV news channel. Towards the end of the 20th century, to be a successful Prime Minister, one needed the press on their side. Thatcher had it, Blair would have it, Major did not. John Major was an unlucky Prime Minister. He inherited a divided Conservative Party that continually challenged his leadership, and this at a time when the normally always civil-warring opposition party Labour were as united as it ever had been behind the media master that was Tony Blair. The economy in the 90s began to pick up, though Major received no praise for it. The decade saw a renewal of interest in British culture abroad. The Britpop and Cool Britannia movements produced hugely successful music groups such as Oasis, Blur and the Spice Girls. 1997 was a landmark year for post-war Britain. It saw the end of the British Empire with the handover of Hong Kong to China, and a rebuilt Labour Party branded as New Labour winning office by a landslide. In power, Labour introduced a federal element to British politics with devolved assemblies in Wales and Scotland, giving more voice to nationalist and local issues. In Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement successfully ended over 30 years of paramilitary fighting. This was the height of Tony Blair's personal popularity. When massive feelings of grief erupted following the death of Princess Diana, the Prime Minister appeared to the nation as one of its chief mourners. Blair's legacy has tended to be judged by his decision to involve Britain in the Second Iraq War. However, before Iraq and Afghanistan, there was Sierra Leone and Kosovo. In both instances, Blair's humanitarian interventions by most measures were successful and the aftermath instantly forgettable by the media. This may have been one reason for his confidence in supporting US action in Afghanistan and Iraq. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, President G.W. Bush declared a war on terror and invoked Article 5 of NATO, calling on the principle of collective defence. Prime Minister Blair, the special relationship once again blooming, was America's key ally in gaining international support for military intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq, where connections, only very removed connections, to the hijackings had been made. The conventional fighting at the beginning of both campaigns saw some of the most one-sided combat in human history, but the swift military occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq were not the end of the conflict, whatever Bush might have thought. Tribal and Islamic fundamentalist insurgencies tied up resources and soldiers in a drawn-out and expensive conflict that achieved few, if any, of its original goals. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found, and the number of active terrorist training facilities and volunteers only increased. The USA took the brunt of this, but Britain also suffered in lives and resources lost. The last British troops did not leave Afghanistan, Britain's fourth war with the Asian nation, until 2014. The war was hugely controversial in Britain and around the world. Unlike the United States, Britain had a sizable and vocal Muslim minority, thanks in part to immigration since 1948. And despite the British government's support, large demonstrations against the war continued, a million gathering in London in 2003 to oppose the invasion of Iraq. Problems of fundamental Islamist terrorism continue to dominate media attention, and on the 7th of July 2005, a series of suicide bombers killed 52 people in London. Intermittent violence continued, and in 2017, London and Manchester were caught up in further terrorist attacks. Anti-foreign sentiment was also on the rise. In 2004, several former communist Eastern European countries joined the EU. Most notable amongst these was Poland. This led to an influx of Polish people and culture. Whereas Italian cafes and Indian curry houses had been an accepted part of the British high street, Polski skleps seemingly were not. By 2014, 10 years later, Poles were the second largest migrant group in the UK after Indians, and calls for checks on immigration from the EU members grew louder. Relations between the police and some communities were still on edge, as demonstrated by the 2011 London riots, sparked by the death in suspicious circumstances of a young black man by police officers. The riots came 1 year before London was due to host the Olympic Games, and were a mixture of social problems, not only to do with race, but also the recession started by the 2008 financial crisis, the worst since the Great Depression of the 1930s. What made the 2011 riots different was the extent social media was harnessed to spread the message. Rioters liaised with each other beforehand through outlets such as Facebook. Since the 2000s, there had been a rise of social media sites where people could publish information, photos and videos of themselves and their friends and families on the internet. Changes in population, the collapse of the finance markets, more devolved assemblies and improved communications all combined to see a rise in popularity to alternatives to the Conservative Labour domination of politics. Nationalist parties like Plaid Cymru in Wales, the SNP in Scotland and the BNP and UKIP in England, and the Green Party all received increased attention. The Liberal Democrats even became the junior partners in a coalition government, the first permanent one since the Second World War. Issues around national identity have also dominated politics, and the results of recent referendums in the country, the 2014 Scottish independence referendum and the 2016 UK EU membership referendum, with their slim majorities, have revealed a near-even division of opinions on these matters. Such divisions have made it difficult for politicians to hold the top job. There have been 3 Conservative Prime Ministers in the space of a decade, all having to work with slim or even no majority of their own party MPs in Parliament. At the same time as all this tumultuous change in the political landscape, the Queen, Elizabeth II, celebrated her 64th anniversary as monarch in 2015. making her the longest reigning sovereign in the history of Britain. Modern Britain's lifestyle, international travel, high population densities, and the reckless use of medicines invite epidemics. That on top of the fact that viruses have an unnerving capacity to burst upon the world in some new and startling form regardless. In 1919, 220,000 people in Britain died from a virus, a type of H1N1. In their attempts to slow the proliferation, schools were closed, public entertainments were shut down, and people everywhere wore masks. A century later, and COVID-19 has brought many of the same responses. This period begins with Prime Minister Thatcher taking office in 1979. Her policies were in stark contrast to previous governments' efforts to improve the British economy. Her handling of the Falklands War in 1982 allowed her to dominate politics for the next 2 election cycles, but the results of her actions are still fiercely debated today. Regardless, unemployment and the economy as a whole continue to be major problems throughout the 1980s. The 1990s, however, saw an improvement in the economy and a flourishing of British culture. The 2001 terrorist attacks in America dominated British politics. Other issues such as the rise of social media, immigration, terrorism, foreign military intervention, the multinational banking system, and national identity have left an increasingly polarised and divided society, though one tiny positive from the COVID-19 pandemic was the improved community spirit it has engendered.